A lot of people underestimate the importance of the electric guitars in a mix, and when you mix them wrong, when you don't use good balancing and good EQ moves, they can really fill up a lot of space in the mix, a lot of space that they don't need. And suddenly your mix can start to sound messy, it can start to sound muddy, and it can start to sound undefined, especially if you're overdubbing and adding several guitar parts. So to help you avoid all of those problems, in this video I'm going to give you 7 of my best tips for mixing guitars to sound separate, clear, aggressive, and also to improve the overall mix and leave lots of room for the other stuff. So tip number 1, and I can't stress the importance of this enough, is to never solo when you're mixing electric guitars. Now let me expand on that a bit. A lot of people say never solo and they kind of leave it at that and expects you to just mix without soloing, which can be quite difficult if you're a beginner or even if you're an intermediate. Sometimes it's hard to hear the changes, especially if the guitars are quite low in the mix. So I'm going to give you a few more tips there. So by avoiding solo, what I mean is mostly avoid soloing one particular channel. We're going to talk more about group bussing in a second, but I like to do a lot of my guitar mixing on a group bus. So sometimes it's okay if you solo that, if you really want to listen in on the relationship between the guitars, but still try to avoid that. My best tip for not mixing in solo is to just bring up the level a bit when you're applying your EQ moves. And you can do that just on the group bus, bring up all the guitars so they're a bit higher in the mix, so that when you start tweaking the EQ, you're still doing it in the context of the mix. You can still hear the vocal, you can still hear the low end, you can still hear the other parts in the mix whilst you're tweaking the guitar, tweaking the EQ, tweaking the compression, but you're still going to be able to hear those changes clearer because you've brought the volume up. Once you've applied those changes, just drop the volume down a bit. So that's tip number 1, and it's really important because if you do mix in solo and you try to make your guitar sound good in solo, they're never going to sound good in the mix. And this used to really mess with me personally. It's something I struggled with for a long time because I always tried to make my guitar sound good in solo. What I would do then is think, well, actually I'm doing this wrong, I need to make them sound good in the mix. So I'd EQ them in the mix, and then after that I'd solo them and they'd sound awful, they'd sound thin, they'd sound tinny, aggressive, and I'd think, this can't be right, it sounds so bad in solo. But that was a massive mistake. In fact, I was on the right track and kind of second guessing myself. It doesn't matter if it sounds awful in solo, all that matters is how it sounds in the mix. So apply EQ in the mix, and then if you do solo it, don't, but if you do and it sounds awful, don't let that put you off. It probably is going to sound awful in solo, and you're going to hear more about why that is in a second, but for now just remember that number 1, try to avoid solo. Tip number 2 is to mute any unnecessary microphones and channels, or to mute any unnecessary parts. So when I'm talking about unnecessary parts, I mostly mean overdubbing. And a lot of people get really carried away with overdubbing the same chords and panning them hard left and hard right, and then adding another set of chords in the middle, all playing the same thing. And they think this is going to make their mix sound heavier, but in fact it does the opposite. It starts to make the mix sound messy, muddy, it removes the aggression, and it starts to become a lot harder to mix because you need to get separation. And if you have 5 guitars all playing the same thing, that's never going to happen. So mute unnecessary parts. You never need more than 2 guitar parts playing the same thing if you are overdubbing. And in general, you want to make sure that the parts have their own space in the mix. So maybe one chordal part that's lower in the open chords, and then one melodic part that's higher up the guitar. But also you might want to mute any unnecessary microphones. So let me give you an example in this mix. I didn't record this. This is someone else who made this recording. I just mixed it. So the first thing I did when I opened this up is went through the pianos and the acoustic guitar and the electric guitar one by one, had a listen, and realised that each part had been recorded with 3 different microphones. So to give you an example on this guitar, I have got a part here. Let's have a listen, and I'll pan it to the centre now. So we've got 3 mics. This one, this one, and this one, which is going to be on the left because it's automated. So what I actually decided was, when I was listening back to these, I didn't want all 3. There was no need for me to balance them. It's quite a dense mix anyway. I liked the tone of this mic, and I actually chose a microphone on the other part because there's 2 guitar parts that complemented that. So both of these were recorded with a C414, which is a small diaphragm condenser, and also I believe an MD421, which is a dynamic mic. So for this part, I chose to use the dynamic mic, which would have a bit warmer sounding and suited the kind of lower register. And then on this part that you could hear in the right ear, I chose to use the C414, so it's a bit brighter. But then I muted the other microphones. I didn't feel like I needed them, didn't feel like they were adding to it. I tried balancing them to create a tone I liked, but instead I just muted them. So that's tip number 2. Mute any unnecessary parts if there are too many overdubs, for example, or mute any unnecessary microphones or channels that you're not using, or DIs or anything else. Number 3 is focus on getting the balance right before processing. So before we move on to EQ, and I'm going to talk more about group processing, before you even get to that, you want to make sure the balance is good. And this is really important. Here, it was about right. I've got some gain staging, so -3 dB on the channel on the left, and then the one on the right is pretty much at 0. So it obviously didn't take me long to get the balancing right here, but spend a few minutes balancing the guitars in the mix one at a time until they're in a really good position. They're not too loud that they're distracting from the vocal or any other lead guitar parts, for example. Not too quiet that they get lost in the mix. You just want them to sit nicely in the mix, complementing and adding aggression, filling out the chords, etc., but not so loud that they distract from the vocal. And just spend a few minutes on that. But then once you've done your balance, you can then go to my 4th tip, which is processing on the group. So you'll see here with these guitar parts, I've only got a bit of gain staging on one just to bring the gain down a bit. Nothing on this one. And then all my processing is on a group bus. So here I've just got all of my group buses. So if we go back to those guitar parts, you'll see they're being sent, the output is electric guitar. So they're not going straight to my submaster or submix or master out or whatever you're using as your master fader. Instead, they're going to this channel here, electric guitar. And then I've got my processing on the channel. So you don't need to process each part individually. It's just going to save you so much more time. You're going to finish your mix with less processing, less plugins, which is always better. And it makes you think more about how the guitars in general sit in the mix. So if you want all the guitars to have a certain pocket in the mix where they're occupying the lower mids or the upper mids, normally it would be somewhere between 1,000 and 6,000 that I would want to exaggerate the electric guitars. Then you can do that on all of them at once. You don't need to do each one individually. Of course, if you do have individual amps or different guitars or different parts that you want to treat individually, that's fine. But prioritize treating the guitars on the group channel. And you can see I haven't actually got any compression on these guitars. So in this video, I'm not going to be talking about compression. Quickly, I can just say that you don't want to use a too fast attack time. You want to use a slower attack time so that the aggression's there, unless it's a really aggressive guitarist who's picking too hard. Then you can use a fast attack time just to catch that pick and that attack. But generally, some light compression, just between 2 and 5 decibels, helps to make the guitar a bit more constant. I didn't feel like I needed it here. So now let's move on to EQ, starting with tip 5, which is don't be afraid to cut the highs and the lows. An electric guitar is a very mid-range heavy instrument. You don't need the low end, it's pointless. The bass and the kick are filling that end of the spectrum, and you don't need the top end because there isn't much top end. There's not much brightness in an electric guitar. All the brightness will come from the upper mids, not so much air and treble above 10 kilohertz, for example. That's all going to be maybe acoustic guitars, vocals, cymbals, that kind of stuff. So by actually removing the lows and removing the highs, you're making room in the mix for everything else. You're making room in the top end for the vocals to shine through, you're making room in the bottom end for the bass and kick to shine through, and you're making sure you're not clogging up the low end, making the mix sound muddy. And by actually cutting the highs, you can put the guitars a bit further back in the mix, which creates depth. In real life, if we hear something with less high frequency content, that means it's further away. So by cutting the highs, you're putting the guitars back in the mix, which creates depth because the vocals are going to be nice and bright right at the front of the mix. If everything was bright, nothing would sound bright, nothing would sound clear. So by cutting the highs in the guitars, you're making the vocals sound clear in relation to the guitars, but you're also adding that element of depth to your mix that you wouldn't have otherwise. And this doesn't apply just to guitars, this applies to everything. Keyboard parts that you want to push further back, reverb, generally you might want to push it further back so you can cut the highs on your reverb bus. Any kind of supportive part, you can cut the highs a bit to put it further back in the mix and create some depth. So I've got 2 cuts going here. I've got a high pass filter at 87, which is actually quite low for me. I'd normally go a bit higher with electric guitars. But I have got a very, very heavy cut at 300 to remove all the low mud. So I didn't feel that was really adding to the tone. I didn't want the guitars to sound warm. In the context of the mix, which we haven't actually heard yet, so if I unsolo these, you'll hear they actually sound quite bright and twangy in solo. Have a listen. But as I said, never solo. I'm just doing that for demo purposes. So you can hear there that they don't sound great in solo, but in the mix, I feel they really occupy that upper mid-range and give it some nice aggression, give it some nice twang. So that's exactly what I wanted to achieve, and that area around 300 wasn't adding to that. It was, if anything, it was just adding mids and mix. So don't be afraid to cut the lows and the low mids as well, quite aggressively. A 9 dB cut there. And then on the top end, I've got a high shelf cut 2 dB at 5.2 kilohertz. And generally I will go that low, around 5 kilohertz. Anything above that you don't really need. To give you an example, let me solo them and then apply a low pass filter. So if we solo, wrong one, so the guitar's here, and bring on just a stock Logic EQ, and listen to how this doesn't really make a difference, especially when I bring this one in. And as I get lower and lower, eventually you'll hear where it starts to affect the tone, but until around 5 or 6K, it's not actually doing that much. So that's where it starts to dull them a bit, when we get to 6-7 kilohertz. And this is because I'm using an aggressive low pass filter. So generally you can do that. I could just put a low pass at 10 kilohertz. We're not really losing anything at all. So normally I would do that. I'd use a low pass filter anywhere around 10 kilohertz. But here I've just gone for a high shelf cut at 5 kilohertz, which is quite low, but like I said, you don't need anything there. So don't be afraid to cut the lows and the highs. And then tip number 6 is don't be afraid to boost the upper mids. And this goes back to that thing of generally people will avoid boosting the upper mids because in solo it doesn't sound good. It makes the guitar sound twangy or brittle or too aggressive. In the context of the mix, this means you can put the guitars a bit lower and boost the upper mids so that they still shine through, but they're not really adding mess, they're not really filling out space in the mix that they don't need. And you're helping to just give the mix a bit more aggression by boosting the upper mids. And it could be anywhere. Here I've actually gone quite low, 1.15 kilohertz. And to find that, if I bypass this one, which I'm going to talk about in a second, I would have just added a boost of a few dB and moved this around until I found a sweet spot that I liked. So in that upper mid-range around here, if you just have a listen to this, if I boost it, you'll sound kind of too brittle. I don't really like how it sounds on this side, this right-hand side of the knob. The guitars already sound a bit twangy, a bit brittle, and that's just far too much. But then when I get lower to this kind of 1 kilohertz region, that's the kind of thing that I want to do. And again, I'd be doing this not in solo. I'm just soloing it so you can hear it better. So let's try again with the mix. So when I'm there, it just feels like a pocket of the mix that kind of needs filling. Up here, it's just a bit too brittle, whereas here, it's kind of adding a nice sound that I like. So I'm just going to go with that. So then I just back this off, play with the width. Generally, you want it to be quite wide with your boost to make it sound a bit more musical. And that's how we settled on that boost. So hopefully you can hear the quality of sound that's adding. But then to compensate for that, because I'm boosting the upper mids, and sometimes if you're not careful it does get too brittle, I've also got a cut here just to compensate because it was getting a bit too messy around 4 kilohertz. So normally if you do boost the upper mids, you might have to add a cut a bit higher or a bit lower just to compensate. So let's have a listen to that. Again, I'm going to go into solo, but in the context of a mix I would be doing this not in solo. So you can hear that just clears it up a bit. Remove some of that brittleness that was kind of added by that 1 kilohertz boost. So that's tip 6. Don't be afraid to boost the upper mids. This does a few things: helps the guitars to cut through, gives aggression to the mix, gives them a space in the mix, because generally there's not going to be much else that's filling that area. Maybe the vocals, just be sure you're not boosting the same frequency that you're boosting on the vocals. And this is a really good pocket in the mix for electric guitars. And then last tip, number 7, is if you're struggling to add separation between the guitar parts. So say you've got an overdub where it's just power chords, slightly distorted, and it's a heavy track, and you're going to pan one hard left and one hard right. Now in stereo that might sound great because they're separated across the stereo field. They're panned hard left and hard right. But then when you flip to mono, they become mushy, they become undefined, they don't complement each other, and they don't really have separation. So to compensate for that, you can just boost them at different points and cut them at different points. So here you can see on the entire group bus, which is where I'm doing my processing, I've boosted 1.35 kilohertz and I've cut 3.56. But now let's say I had 2 guitar parts that were very similar and I wanted them to sound different. Now first of all, if you are doing overdubs, flip the tone switch on your guitar. That's the easiest way to do it. Or change the amp settings a bit so it sounds slightly different. Every time you add a new guitar part, make it sound a bit different. Otherwise they can get a bit messy and they start to become undefined. So that's a really easy way. But in the mix, what you can do is, if on one guitar, for example, like here, I've boosted at 1.35 and cut at 3.56, well, pan that left, and then on the right hand guitar, just do the opposite. Cut it at 1.5 and boost it at 3.56. So now what's happening is one is occupying that space where it's being boosted at 3.56, but it's not occupying that space, so we're giving room to the other guitar, which is the opposite. I like to call this range allocation because you're allocating a specific frequency range to each guitar. If you boost one guitar at 2 kilohertz, cut the other one at 2, and boost that one at 4 and cut the other one at 4. I've got a whole video all about range allocation, which I'll link to in the description below if you want to learn more about that. So that's it for guitar mixing. Hope you find that useful. Just to summarize those 7 tips, and number 1, never use solo, or at least try to avoid it. Instead, just bring up the volume a bit if you're struggling to hear your changes. And if you do solo and it sounds bad, don't let that put you off, because it's probably going to sound bad in solo. Number 2, mute any unnecessary parts or microphones that aren't adding to the music or the mix. Number 3, focus on getting the right balance before you even use EQ or compression or anything else. Number 4, process on the group channel, so apply your EQ and compression on the group channel. It saves you a lot of time. The only time you want to go into each individual channel is if they're different microphones, they're different guitars, for example, or you want to add separation with that range allocation technique. Otherwise, try to do it on the group bus. Number 5, cut the lows and the highs. You don't need the low end, you don't need the top end. By cutting the top end, you're adding depth to the mix and making room for the vocals, and you don't need the low end, it's muddying up the mix, so you can remove that. Number 6, don't be afraid to boost the upper mids, because that's a really good frequency area for the guitars to sit in. And again, don't worry if they sound bad in solo, because it's all about how they sound in the mix. And then finally, number 7 was that range allocation tip, where you can boost one guitar on the right hand side at a certain frequency and cut the left guitar at the same frequency, and then vice versa to give each guitar its own space in the mix. So I hope you found that useful. In this video we've mostly talked about EQ, and that's because compression isn't as important on a guitar or electric guitar. If you want, you can add 2 to 5 dB of compression just to make the guitar sit better in the mix, make it a bit more manageable. But generally it's more about EQ and balancing when you're mixing guitars. So thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.